With 5 kilometers to go, all three were neck and neck, floating through growing early morning crowds as the end approached. The pace never wavered, the three remaining a close bunch. The lead changed hands several times. First Wainaina strode into a brief lead before being caught. Then Tugwani surged before he too was hauled in. No other athlete was in sight. It was just Wainaina, Tugwani, and Bong-ju. 3 men for 3 medals. In what order? Nobody knew. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. In 1996, an illiterate janitor from Mpumalanga in South Africa won the gold medal for the Olympic marathon. This is his unbelievable story. In 2018, I drove up to Pretoria to meet Josiah Tugwani and find out about his exceptional story. The following is an extract I wrote for my book, Vuvuzela Dawn, about how Josiah won gold in the men's marathon, Atlanta, August 1996. There is something almost biblical about Josiah Tugwani's early life. As a herd boy for his uncle on a farm in Bethel, on the ample green lands of Mpumalanga east of Johannesburg, his hours were long and lonely. When he was just a boy, his father vanished, leaving Tugwani's mother with the responsibility of raising her children alone. At first she dutifully obliged, but being a single mother finally overcame her. She too absconded, leaving the 4-year-old Tugwani in the care of his maternal grandmother and his uncle. As a herd boy, he earned 10 rand a month, less than 30 cents a day, supplemented by a monthly ration of a 50-kilogram bag of millie meal. Although his uncle's children went to school, Tugwani was prevented from doing so. His uncle insisted he stay in the fields and mind the cattle, so he never learned to read or to write. To all intents and purposes, he was without parents and, like so many of his countrymen in similar circumstances for whom there were few alternatives, condemned to a life of rural toil. For years his horizons were as low as the land in which he grew up. Finally, when he was 16 or 17, he doesn't quite remember, he plucked up the courage to leave. Having confided in his gogo, or his grandmother, he slipped away in the middle of the night. As luck would have it, a woman in nearby Kriel, roughly 30 kilometers from Bethel, employed him to tend her garden where he could make use of at least some of the skills picked up while working his uncle's land. She helped me a lot, that woman, says Tugwani. She gave me a sponge and she gave me a blanket. There was also work with the neighbors. I was earning 2.50 rand a day. I saw Job Mahlangu and his runners. That is why I ran away to work in the garden, because there it was easy to train. Job Mahlangu was a charismatic local athlete older than Tugwani, and he was a seminal early influence, as significant as mentor Jacques Malan was to become later. Mahlangu worked as a driver at the Koenfontein coal mine near Kriel, but he is largely remembered as being everything from chairman to chief bottle washer for the Koenfontein Athletics Club. One day, with his gardening duties complete, Tugwani took a perch on a fence post and waited for Mahlangu's training group of athletes to pass. As they did, he asked if he could join them. Although Josiah ran in a pair of black school shoes, Mahlangu noted with approval that the youngster haired to the front of the group. He clearly had spunk. Mahlangu bought him his first pair of trainers and encouraged him to persist. He discovered that all Tugwani wanted to do was run in a marathon. Without having any conception of its distance, he was obsessed with the event. So Mahlangu counseled caution. Ration your energies, he urged. Train with care. You are still young. Don't run for money too often. You'll burn out. You have time enough to become a champion. It was Mahlangu who realized that there was no future for Tugwani tending gardens. He was too vulnerable living by himself, too exposed. The rewards were too meager. Mahlangu recognized that the young athlete needed support, preferably a kind of sinecure or form of sheltered employment that allowed Tugwani ample freedom to train. Before Tugwani could be employed by the Koenfontein coal mine, however, he needed an identity document known archaically as a book of life in South Africa. Without it, he was unemployable. At the same time, in 1989, Mahlangu was taking his crew of athletes to a marathon at Sun City, and Tugwani begged to tag along. Having arrived, Tugwani implored Mahlangu again, this time to enter him in the race. Mahlangu was more bemused than exasperated. Although he talked about it constantly, Josiah had no conception of what a marathon entailed, of what it required, of what it meant. He hadn't so much as seen the course. He had never run 42.2 kilometers before, let alone with some of the country's most experienced marathon athletes. What could possibly be achieved but a breaking of Tugwani's spirit? On the other hand, a thin flame flickered in Tugwani's eyes. He was hungry and fearless, an aggressive runner who liked to dash to the front. Had he not beaten some of Mahlangu's most talented older athletes on the group's training runs around Kriel, what exactly was there to lose? Tugwani ran that day in a bubble of sublime ignorance, never giving up and staying the course. He finished a remarkable 5th, which earned him 900 Rand, and according to an excellent article by Mike Wise, published in Runner's World in 2016, a 300 Rand down payment on a pair of Nike Vendettas. The Sun City Marathon was covered in the nation's newspapers, which published both the race report and the result. With Tugwani's name in the paper, Mahlangu had some leverage with mine management. Here was proof positive that the young man had promise. Tugwani didn't, however, have a book of life, and getting one wasn't going to be easy. Although he had been abandoned by both parents, he needed their identity documents to prove that he was their son. How to proceed? He and Mahlangu came up with an ingenious plan. They would find another Tugwani and borrow his papers, Josiah pretending to be his child and hoping that the ruse wouldn't be exposed by the Home Affairs official. Quote, I had to find somebody with that surname. It was a problem, says Tugwani, but it was okay. We found that somebody. Part of Tugwani's application for an identity document involved a secondary dispute about the date of his birth. The official record suggests that he was born in 1971, but he insists that he turned 50 on the 15th of April 2018, meaning that he was born in 1968, not 1971. There was further uncertainty about the spelling of his name, a matter for teasing and gentle ribbing by several of his later entourage, including Coach Bobby McGee and agent Tony Longhurst. They pointed out that Josiah could be spelt phonetically, Josaya, Josiah, but the man himself begs to differ. He insists on Josiah without the H, just as he insists on the H in Tugwani, Thugwane. In my ID, there is no Y, he says adamantly. Mahlangu found Tugwani a menial job as a cleaner and janitor on the Koenfontein coal mine. This allowed him to live in the mined compound and train twice daily with Mahlangu's group of athletes. The Koenfontein group could only improve. South Africa's long-distance and marathon running in the early 1990s was full of events, well-sponsored and highly competitive, and Mahlangu looked forward to a period of calm and growth. He had high hopes for his young Ndebele road warrior. Quote, at first there were people to confuse me on the mine and say, do this, come and work at this time, but I told Job that I would leave the mine and go back to working in the garden if they kept up with this nonsense, said Tugwani. After a little bit, there was nobody to confuse me, so then I could get more of a chance to train and run for money. Tugwani's early years had hardened him, made him wary and vigilant. In truth, he had a stubborn streak. Some thought him intractable. He didn't take orders easily. Neither did he slot easily into the training group. At the same time, he was fiercely loyal to Mahlangu, capable of repaying Mahlangu's trust many, many times over. But life was still a grind. Money and the temptation to run solely for financial reward remained an issue, yet Tugwani bedded down, trying to catch up on his lost years when he tended cattle on the Bethel farm. At the same time, South Africa was changing, trembling on the cusp of a new dispensation, sometimes with violent results. On the mine, Tugwani could ride out the winds of change, watch them buffet the rest of the country while he remained untouched. For the first time in his life, he was sheltered and, in the company's paternal embrace, he grew. In 1991, he sought out his father, Dr. Tugwani, who had returned to the farm in Bethel. 2 years later, in late April or early May, Josiah isn't exactly sure, he married Zodwa. Zandi was born later that year and Tundi in 1996, when Tugwani was in a pre-Olympic training camp in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Tugwani had always taken himself seriously, but others now began to view him as a threat. The long-distance running scene was competitive, not only in South Africa, but also across Southern Africa as a whole, with athletes from Namibia, Lesotho, and Zimbabwe frequently adding their names to local races. Many mines provided support to runners and, with regular television coverage, sponsors with brands such as Olsen's Lager, Keller Prince Wines, Weet-Bix breakfast cereal, and Citizen Watches were only too happy to associate themselves with events. Mark Plaatjes was still running as a South African. He later won the World Marathon Champs in Stuttgart in 1993 as an American, with Namibia's Lucas Swartboy, who followed Plaatjes into second place in Stuttgart, a regular feature of the local scene. Tugwani began to suss out who was who. He grew wiser and faster. In the South African Marathon Championship in Cape Town ahead of the Olympics in 1992, he finished fourth, hoping that the result would qualify him for Barcelona as a travelling reserve. David Sebe, who finished seventh, was picked instead. So I asked why, and they told me, not much experience. So okay, I went away to work on getting some more experience. Under Mahlangu's watchful eye, Tugwani widened his exposure, but it wasn't easy. His gains were incremental and sometimes painful, and often he struggled. The Honolulu Marathon at the end of 1993 was a case in point. I finished 40-something, if I remember, he says. It was very hot, so the conditions for running were very difficult. That's why I failed to do good. Also, in 93, it was the race for Lee Bong-ju. Lee Bong-ju was a South Korean Tugwani would later meet in the 1996 Olympic marathon final. Quote, "He's a short guy, but he's a very strong guy. He won that time in Hawaii." While running the New York City Marathon in 1995, Tugwani bailed just after halfway, cold and dehydrated. He ended up on a drip in a tent watching others finish. All of these setbacks were chalked up to experience. Tugwani missed the Honolulu Marathon in 1994, but was back the following year. The pre-dawn start was designed to avoid the rising tropical heat, and video footage of the event shows the pace setters ghosting past trees yoked with fairy lights and Christmas decorations. The Kenyan, Benson Masia, gunning for his fourth victory in 5 years, was an early favourite, followed closely by compatriot Jimmy Muindi. The South African Johannes Mambitle, the stalking horse, went out hard, leading the front pack by a narrow margin for the first 65 minutes. By halfway, with the sun rising over the mountains and a breeze already blowing in from the Pacific, Mambitle faded away. Tugwani took the lead from a chasing pack that included not only the two highly ranked Kenyans, but also athletes from South Korea, Lesotho, and Tanzania. With 3/4 of the race complete, only Masia in the number 1 bib and Tugwani remained. Tugwani looked momentarily discomfited as the two climbed a slight incline close to the end, but managed to compose himself sufficiently for an assault on the finish. Within sight of the line, Tugwani, a janitor on a South African coal mine, battled with Masia, the former Kenyan postman. With approximately 200 meters to go and the two neck and neck, Tugwani made his move, breaking the Kenyan, who was unable to respond. Tugwani, suffering from cramps and discomfort from some way out, had managed to prevail. Now he was done. It was his inaugural international victory, and it proved that his 5th place at the World Half Marathon Championships in France in October was no fluke. At the time, Masia was nigh invincible. He streaked to a string of 4 victories in the Great North Run, and had won the World Half Marathon Championships in 1992. He might have been suffering from the after effects of a bout of malaria in Honolulu. No one is quite sure. To beat him and Mwindi, who finished third, was no small achievement. Suddenly, Tugwane had become an athlete to watch. Tugwane's stellar form continued into the new year. In February 1996, he won the SA Marathon Championships on a blustery course in Cape Town, although he did so in a comparatively slow time. There was controversy about Tugwane's win from the very beginning. Ordinarily, the winner would be a shoo-in for the Olympic team, but the administrators tut-tutted and wrung their hands. Benele Sindani, the head of Athletics South Africa, was not convinced of Tugwane's credentials. Then Old Mutual, sponsors of the SA champs, weighed in. With race organizer Bernard Rose, a prominent voice, they pointed out that it devalued their sponsorship if the winner of a race they supported wasn't deemed good enough for the Olympics. Quote, "We announced the team directly after the race," says Bob Norris, then manager of the men's Olympic marathon team, "and we chose Tugwane because we felt he would be well suited to the Atlanta conditions, not because he was fastest. It certainly created major unhappiness with Lawrence Pugh's manager, because we chose Lawrence as a traveling reserve." In the event, Tugwane found himself in the team for Atlanta, along with Zolile Yawa and Gert Thys. Pugh was chosen but not expected to run, except in an emergency. With the proceeds from Tugwane's win in Honolulu the previous year, he was given 47,000 Rand from a purse of $20,000, he says. He bought a second-hand 2.2 Mazda Drifter Bakkie for 37,000 Rand. When driving along the back roads of Mpumalanga in his bakkie, or his pickup truck, shortly after the SA Marathon Champs, Tugwane recognized two hitchhikers on the side of the road and stopped to offer them a lift. He suspected that something was wrong, however, when he noticed he was being followed by another car, but all he could do was to wait it out and hope for the best. Then one of the two hitchhikers pulled a gun on him, and when they tried to grab his keys from the ignition, he swerved the bakkie. In the ensuing scuffle, he was shot through the fleshy part of the chin. Bleeding profusely, he flung himself from the car, injuring his back in the process. In the relief of discovering that he had survived the tumble, he realized that he was wounded and that he was struggling to walk. And if he couldn't walk, what chance was there that he'd be able to run? Quote, "I was hurt so badly," he said at the time, "I lost all hope. I did not think I'd be in the Olympics. I did not even think that I'd be able to recover." Every day for 3 weeks, a mine driver transported Tugwane into Witbank, where he saw a physiotherapist. She worked on a bulging disc in his lower back, patiently nursing his body and spirit back to health. He began to run again. His bakkie was found by the police and returned. With other members of the team, he attended a high-altitude training camp in nearby Sabi in Mpumalanga. Before long, he was packing his bag with a 5-kilogram sack of mealie meal, kissing Zodwa goodbye, and heading off to Albuquerque for a pre-Olympic training camp organized by his new Colombian agent, Tony Pozzo. Pozzo was assisted in the organizing of the camp by Jacques Milan, a new figure on the landscape. A manager in the Forex department of FNB in the Johannesburg CBD, Milan was born in Dundee in northern KwaZulu-Natal. A Comrades marathon athlete with a big heart, he finished the Comrades 9 or 10 times, according to his wife Annelise. Milan was passionate about the sport. Added to his zeal was a logistical wizardry. Quote, "Jacques could get things done," says Annelise, his wife. He took time off from his job at Bank City to be with the athletes in the house in Albuquerque, and because he could speak Zulu, he and Josiah became very good friends. You could say that Jacques was a bit of a homeboy for those boys. When Tugwane's 5-kilogram bag of mealie meal had been polished off by the hungry athletes in Albuquerque, it was Milan who picked up the phone to Sam Ramsamy, head of the National Olympic Committee of South Africa, pleading for more. Milan did the laundry and most of the cooking in the Albuquerque house, but was gently prevented from straying into the realms of the sacred. Pup or millie meal porridge was Tugwani's domain. Quote, "There were 5 in the house, so we finished my bag of millie meal quickly," says Tugwani. Jacques had to make a plan with Sam Ramsamy for more bags of millie meal. We ate morojo, which is wild African spinach, and sometimes we ate cabbage, also steak. Me, I specialize in pup. In the training camp in New Mexico, I got to know Jacques a little better. He was a very nice person, my father. Whenever I had a problem, I went to Jacques. He understood me as an athlete. Although Tugwani suffered from occasional bouts of loneliness, he loved being in Albuquerque. He liked the environment, the big blue skies, and he felt reassured having Yawa, his training partner, close by. He pumped the older man for information, squeezing him for intel and anecdote. He often woke early while the rest of the house was still asleep to head off into the hills on an early morning run, returning to catch up on the sleep he'd missed before the rest of the house had even woken. The days were long, the routine unvarying. Early morning training for Tugwani, usually followed by lighter informal training later in the day. Sometimes the group trooped across to neighbor John Bednarski's house to use his telephone so they could call home in South Africa. Tugwani was persuaded to cut off his dreadlocks, and it was respectfully suggested that there was no need to put his bed on bricks to ward off the togolosh, a mischievous underworld creature with a very long penis that could climb onto your bed. Big meals punctuated the steady rhythm of running and sleeping. Towards evening, there was often a walk in the hills. Quote, "They didn't mess around there either," recalls Bob Norris. "They headed off at pace, walking 6, 8, 10 kilometers, I guess, before returning home." Norris remembers that Tugwani could be staunchly literal about middle-of-the-day training distances. Quote, "About 3 or 4 weeks before the Olympics, we were up in the mountains and it's damn hot, so we said to him, 'Joss, you've run 32 kilometers already. Are you sure you want to continue?' He turned to us all in the car and said that the training schedule demanded 37 kilometers, so that was exactly what he was going to do." Other than dwindling supplies of pup, there were precious few distractions in the months leading up to the Olympics. The group went on a jaunt to the movies, where they were enthralled by the nutty professor. Tugwani had 3 rotten front teeth removed, requiring a period of convalescence, the procedure recording George Orwell's famous quote in The Road to Wigan Pier, that people over 30 in industrial areas who still have their own teeth is coming to be an abnormality. The extraction possibly explains his slightly lopsided smile in the post-victory celebration photographs. For his time in the dentist's chair, he received a T-shirt that read, "I had my teeth pulled by Dr. Taub." Only weeks before the Olympics, Yawa discovered a stress fracture of the tibia and was replaced by Pew. The disappointment in the camp was palpable. Yawa was a source of wisdom and inspiration to Tugwani, invaluable in helping him with his speed work and fartlek, a type of speed training developed in Scandinavia in which athletes continually vary their pace. For his part, Pew was doubly thrilled. Not expecting to run in Atlanta, he decided to run a half marathon in Paris on the way home. He had booked a flight to New York, another across the Atlantic via Paris, and eventually on to Rome before changing his mind at the last minute. He was happy he had. News later filtered through that the flight he was meant to take, TWA Flight 800 to Rome, had crashed into the sea off Long Island. There were no survivors. Although they remained in Albuquerque until shortly after the start of the Centennial Games, Norris impressed upon the team the need to attend the opening ceremony. The team flew in from New Mexico, not realizing who had been chosen to light the Olympic flame. The organizers successfully managed to keep Muhammad Ali's appearance a secret, so there was a collective intake of breath when Ali appeared, high above them in the white suit, walking slowly. His left arm shook visibly, the result of Parkinson's disease, but he was composed enough to light the flame with a torch held in his right hand. Tugwani and his team were thrilled. Ali's lighting of the flame made the experience of being at the Olympics so much more concrete and tangible and real. After the opening ceremony, the team returned to Albuquerque, where it was cooler than midsummer Atlanta. They arrived back in the athletes' village 3 days before the men's marathon, traditionally the final event of the Games. Tugwani and the rest of the team woke at 5 a.m. on the morning of the race, which had been brought forward to 7:05. The start meant to offset Atlanta's cloying heat. Tugwani asked Norris to pop down to a McDonald's for a white bread roll for breakfast, which he ate while sipping rooibos tea. Norris recalls that the South Africans warmed up together. Few other teams, he noticed, did the same. It struck him as propitious. The South Africans reckoned that they would hunt as a pack. That way, one of them would be sure to be there at the end. It was an open field in a difficult-to-call race. Spain's Martin Fietz had a chance, as did Luis dos Santos of Brazil. In with the shout too were Antonio Pinto of Portugal, Dionisio Cerrón of Mexico, and Rich Nyaruka of Great Britain. The South Africans were strengthened by their unity as a team. Many of the pre-race favourites ran as individuals, a fact reinforced when all three, Tace, Pugh and Tugwani, surged to the front of the leading bunch after 24 kilometres. Approaching the 27-kilometre mark, the green wall was joined by Bong-ju, Tugwani's old adversary from the Honolulu Marathon. Tugwani was respectful of the South Korean. Running in his distinctive white headband, Bong-ju was strong-striding and inscrutable. Tugwani was wary. By 31 kilometres, the leading pack of around 30 had thinned. Tace and Pugh melted away, many others also finding the pace and humidity too much. Tugwani moved ahead and Bong-ju responded. They were joined by Kenya's Eric Wainaina with his economical upright stride as the three jockeyed for ascendancy in the last quarter of the race. Quote, "I ran too slowly, which allowed Wainaina to join us, and then it was 3. That was a mistake," said Tugwani. Quote, "I wanted to kick before that, but the guy said, no, it's too early, you can't kick." And then suddenly Wainaina came to join us. Tugwani was blithely unconcerned by Wainaina, who was running in only his 5th marathon ever. Even though the Kenyan went on to a slight lead at just over 35.5 kilometres, it didn't faze the South African. Quote, "I wasn't worried," says Tugwani. "I saw how hard he had to work just to remain in front. Bong-ju, he was the one I really feared." With 5 kilometres to go, all three were neck and neck, floating through growing early morning crowds as the end approached. The pace never wavered, the three remaining a close bunch. The lead changed hands several times. First Wainaina strode into a brief lead before being caught. Then Tugwani surged before he too was hauled in. No other athlete was in sight. It was just Wainaina, Tugwani, and Bong-ju, 3 men for 3 medals. In what order? Nobody knew. The final water station was just outside the stadium, and it was here that Tugwani made his move. Finding energy he didn't know that he had, he darted past the South Korean and the Kenyan as he skipped down the ramp towards the stadium itself. As he flowed onto the track, he shot several looks behind him, 2 over his right shoulder, another over his left. The distance between him and Bong-ju and Wainaina remained, but only just. As Tugwani clipped into the stadium, he was greeted with a surge of noise and colour. He remembers looking up and seeing Milan in the stands, frantically shouting that he needed to do a full lap before he could finish. Again he glanced anxiously over his shoulder. Bong-ju, having eclipsed Wainaina in the tunnel, was now in 2nd place, less than 10 seconds behind. Thundering down the back straight, Tugwani circled the track, maintaining his lead. He was nearly home. As he crossed the line, he found the strength to join the tips of his fingers together above his head, repeating the motion 3 times. He had beaten the South Korean by 3 seconds and heralded Wainaina coming into 3rd. It was the closest finish in the Olympic marathon's history. 12 hours later, as part of the closing ceremony of the Olympics in 1996, Tugwani received the gold medal, the first black South African to do so. A man of few words, he said that only months before he had lost all hope because of the hijacking of his pickup. He dedicated the victory to Nelson Mandela and the newly enfranchised people of South Africa. His efforts to end apartheid made us all free, said Tugwani, free to run. Tugwani's post-Atlanta life has been an improvement on his early years minding cattle on his uncle's farm, but it has not been without complication. Coca-Cola, headquartered in Atlanta, sponsored him until the Sydney Games 4 years after Atlanta, specifying that the relationship would only be renewed if he won gold in Sydney, which he failed to do. The Atlanta office became embroiled in a disagreement with their South African subsidiary, who had to stump up Tugwani's sponsorship money, an obligation they honored with reluctance. He has been similarly mistreated by sponsors such as Liberty Life, who told him he was no good as an ambassador if he wasn't running at all times. His relationships with Athletics South Africa and Noxa is too tangled a web to unravel. Such tribulations are minor when compared to what Tugwani suffered as a younger man. He recently sold his house in Cresta in northwestern Johannesburg and returned to the land on which he grew up. He currently lives on a 30-hectare farm outside of Bronkhorstspruit and is, by all accounts, happy. His daughters are well provided for through a trust fund. He has petrol for his car and there is food on the table. Josiah has always told me that he doesn't want to live large, says Dries Lessing, his new manager, and a man as remarkable in his own quiet way as was Milan. Quote, he suffers from asthma and worries about his health. He has an obsession that he's not going to leave anything for his children if he dies, so there's good money in the trust. Tugwani's greatest heartbreak concerns Milan. In 1998, Milan was diagnosed with colon cancer. The cancer spread to his liver, and by the end of June 2000, shortly before Tugwani left for Sydney, he was dead. Although his friend has been dead for over 18 years, Tugwani still misses him terribly. It was a wildly improbable relationship to begin with, the son of a Dundee policeman who befriended an illiterate minder of cattle from the backwaters of Mpumalanga. They shared a common language and a profound love of athletics, but agreed to disagree about who was best qualified to cook pap or porridge. They were many things, friends, brothers, a father and a son, but finally they were simply proud South Africans together.